So we'll move to the agenda, and item 1 on the agenda is apologies.
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Peake, and we are still waiting to see if Councillor Stutely arrives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Item 2 on the agenda is public questions and petitions. Have we had any, Jackie?
No, Chair.
Wonderful, thank you. Item 3 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Any members? No, I see no indications. So we'll move on to item 4 of the agenda, is the minutes from the previous meeting in November. These have been circulated to members ahead of the meeting, and I assume that everyone has had a look through those. So are there any issues from the minutes from members? Nope, I see no indication. So we'll take those and agree those minutes. Yeah, we're in agreement, committee. Yep, I see indications. Thank you. So we'll move on to item 5 of the agenda, which is the audit annual audit letter 1920. And I presume I'll hand over to Mark for this. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, committee members. So the purpose of the annual audit letter is to summarise the key messages from the 2019-20 audit. And we did conclude that on the 12th of January. So if I rewind slightly, so we had our audit results report, which is the detailed findings from the audit, which we presented and talked you through on the 24th of November. The inspection period that was re-advertised ran until the 12th or the 11th of January, and there was no matters coming out of that. And since your meeting on the 24th of November, there were no further material amendments coming out of any residual audit work, and all our property, plant and equipment valuation work on investment properties found that all the assets were within an acceptable range. So we did report both of those messages in an email update to the chair ahead of him approving the financial statements under the delegated authority provided to him at the last committee. And therefore we signed and closed the audit on the 12th of January. And therefore this annual audit letter doesn't say anything new, but just pulls out the key messages in a more public facing way, so the letter can go on to the council's website. I wasn't proposing to say any more than that at that stage, but happy to take any questions, Chair.
Yep, no, thank you, Mark. I think you've summarised the point of the item well. I will just look around the room to members to see if there are any issues, and I see Councillor Wright indicated.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mark, for the letter. I have just one question that relates to page 25 of our agenda pack and page 11 of your letter. At the very bottom there is about the going concern disclosures. It talks about the council assessing the impact of COVID-19 on its income, expenditure, cash. Can I just get a sense, presumably you're very comfortable with the approach that officers have taken, that the council's taken in terms of the analysis of potential risk in relation to COVID-19 when coming to your assessment of this audit, and are you sort of happy with the strategy we have going forward? Thank you.
No problem, good question. So yes, as part of our procedures on going concern, we did review and challenge management's own assessment of going concern, which did primarily focus on liquidity of the council, so kind of the cash position and the ability to have cash to provide ongoing services. So it's less about, for us, the amount of reserves held by the council, but how much cash do you have to actually pay staff to be able to provide those services. That's kind of the difference of where a going concern standard is coming from an auditor's perspective, because we all know that councils will continue ad infinitum, whether it's in the Norwich City name or however it's amalgamated in any sense going forward. So that was our focus, and yes, we were comfortable with management's assessment, and then the disclosure note put together, which was in the financial statement, setting out that assessment in essence. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. And are any other members indicating any questions or views on the letter? Nope, I don't see any indications. And so, yes, I mean, just to summarise, I think Mark put it all together there. It is a kind of front-facing document of the document we've looked at and discussed it at length in the past. and I'm happy to accept this here now. We've reviewed and noted the report, so I'm happy to move on, and members are. I see no issue why not to, so we will move on to the next item of the agenda. Thank you, Mark. That is the item 6 on your agenda. That's the External Audit Plan 2021, discussion on development of the External Audit Plan. So I'm sure Mark will talk us through where we're at and effectively perhaps why we haven't got a draft version now. Mark.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think that we were expecting a draft version to be ready, but the purpose of this meeting is to get a sense from the committee around where the risks lie for the council that we can take into account during our formal planning phase of the audit and build into the audit plan. So this really is a key discussion point for us. It may be you don't have any, which is fine, but ordinarily I would expect there to be audit risks, as you've seen in the past couple of years, around management override, because management could, if they so deemed, override controls to gain a better financial reporting position. I very rarely see it, but clearly there is the potential for that to happen on all audits. We'd also consider property, plant and equipment valuation because of the size of property, plant and equipment balance on the balance sheet, and similarly the pension liability also on the balance sheet. So those are kind of big ticket items that we'd all have on an audit plan. I think we need to sit down with officers and discuss the impact of COVID on the council's activities and how that translates into actual accounting for a year-end set of accounts. So potentially around grant funding in the year and the consideration of any provisions for bad debts, because we are, as auditors, expecting debtor balances to increase in the year as a result of COVID-19. So they're kind of the areas that we have in our lens for focus at the moment. But as I say, I'm interested in the committee's views, whether we've missed anything or you'd like us to take anything into account when we're having those discussions with officers before we draw up our formal plan to present to you at your next meeting.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for explaining that. And it's good to have good open dialogue on such a subject and giving the committee an opportunity to input into that process. So I think it's only fair for me to look around the cabinet member, the council members rather, and to see if there are any strong feelings that they have, the areas that we'd like you to be looking at, Mark. So I'm just looking around for any indications from members. I'm not seeing anyone at the moment, so I might just kick off a little bit. I would say that, you know, based upon the report of the internal audit officer at the previous meeting in November, and also the quarterly report that is being brought today, there's a few areas where we've had kind of a limited assurance, and so in some ways the limited assurance that we received around policies and procedures last year, in the last meeting, and although there is ongoing work, which is positive to see that the actual council are looking to mitigate that, I feel that there is a level of risk inherent to the fact that a lot of these policies have not been updated in over 5 years, and that there is no currently, and I will ask for an update at the next item, but currently there is no procedure in place or to have a kind of a set review period. So I think that does create a liability. So that would be one area that I would personally say that I would would like to see some focus on. I would say that when we've also got in this quarterly report, which will be coming up later, we've got the limited assurance over a contract management around a certain area. That was the waste contract, and I think it's important and good work that the council has done to look at an area like that, but also to see that there was issues around the recommendations of effectively kind of monitoring and assessing those kind of performances of those contracts. Again, that makes me ask the question whether or not there are greater risks associated with a wider range of contracts. And so I think when we get into talking about the audit plan for next year, which is the final item on today's agenda, I think, which is set by CLT. I think that will be a question that I'll be posing then, but the contract management effectively. And so to go back to policies and procedures, Mark, I would say that, and so, you know, if the council hasn't been robustly operating a review of policies and procedures, for me it raises concerns about capital spending and how we are deciding capital spending, because I'm not sure of how that policy works and if that policy is robust and fit for purpose. And procurement effectively, and getting and knowing if the policies that we have around procurement, say through the HRA, is robust and is getting the council value for money. So those would be the areas I would say that I have an interest in having a focus on. I think we've done a lot of work around NRL, and I think that there's been a great steps made by the council. So I think because there is a certain risk factor with that, I think it's important that there is some focus on that. And of course, the other area is the work around the major amount of insourcing that the council is doing in terms of the joint ventures. We've got the first service coming online. I think we've got some good practice where we've got some work, consultancy work from internal audit as we are sourcing. So I think the council are making right steps, but it is a large area of risk and finance. So, that would be another area that I would say perhaps need to focus. So that's for me, but I'm very interested in any other points from members in other areas, or points on the ones that I've raised. And I see Councillor Schmira is indicating.
Yeah, can I, thank you very much, Chair. And I suppose my question is a little bit brief and probably less, maybe a bit more focused on a specific issue, which if I could just refer members to page 18 of the executive, page 18 of our agenda, so the executive summary. There were a couple of points I just wish to flag. I think one of which Councillor Price has already, Councillor Wright has already done so, but the other one is about the information produced by the entity towards the bottom of the page under the impact on scope of our audit. And in it, you say we identified an increased risk about the completeness, accuracy, and appropriateness of the information produced by the entity due to the inability of the audit team to verify original documents. Now, I assume that obviously as we move a lot more online, and I think that this is going to become a bit more of a sort of permanent fixture rather than a sort of abnormality, I assume that there will be procedures in place to make sure that there are mechanisms and protocols, as you kind of already allude to in here, to make sure that obviously the information that you're assessing and commenting on is obviously fair and accurate. Can I just get that from you, please?
Certainly, yeah. So we wouldn't have signed our audit opinion if we weren't satisfied we'd got appropriate audit evidence, and that did cover all of IP categories. It was a specific issue this year because ordinarily we would be on site working with officers and they could just show us a document or hand over a document live. Clearly, working remotely has meant that we've had to schedule additional meetings via Teams or Zooms to be able to just verify it in a virtual live scenario. So I think you're right, Councillor, that we are moving our audit procedures to encompass that, but it was only right that we picked it out for members' attention in last year's audit because it was a specific set of different circumstances for that year. So it would become more of the norm as we go forward, and we don't have an issue with that.
Thank you for that comment, Mark. Did you need to come back on that, Councillor Schmira? No, that's fine. So I'm just look around for any new points from councillors, and Councillor Laura McCartney-Gray. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I see that we are expecting a summary of findings and agreed action plan to come to the committee, the next committee meeting around the equality duties, and a report for that. I would just like us to bear in mind that because of the action plan that we may have to bring that back at some point in the new year going forward, once it's had a time to bed down and there's been an opportunity to work on the action plan.
Thank you, Councillor. So is that something that you feel that needs to be looked at or considered through the external audit, or is that for the next item?
Oh yes, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Ignore me.
That's fine. No, okay, that's fine. But it is a relevant point for that item. I totally agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any other indication at the moment. Councillor Stutley's just joining us, and that's good. Councillor Stutley, to just inform you that Mark here from External Audit is just here to get any ideas of where we feel that some of their work and focus should be next year in producing the annual audit plan. Councillor Schmira and myself have put forward a couple of ideas. I'll give you a minute a few seconds to think about that, Councillor Stutley, to see if there are any areas you think that Mark should be focusing on. And so while Councillor Stutley's thinking about that, so Mark, if the points that I kind of raised around capital spending, procurement, the JV insourcing, and less so NRL as kind of large financial risks, did you have a view on those areas that I've kind of put to you?
Thank you. They are all areas that I recognise could have a potential impact, and I think it would be appropriate for me to discuss those with Annabelle and Hannah as part of the planning discussions, and indeed with where internal audit have already reported on those. For me, we would consider whether either of them or both of them have an impact on the overall control environment that operates at Norwich, and whether that would then lead to a material misstatement in the financial statements, and that's the key concept we're considering, or whether arrangements are so inadequate that it therefore become a risk for our value for money conclusion. So we might not specifically do work on those areas in individual level, but we would have to consider whether they impacted on those two specific avenues into an audit risk, if you like. So yes, they're valid areas which I'll pick up with Annabelle, Hannah and Gavin as part of the planning process.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. And obviously we can see that is the perspective that you need to come from on that particular issue. So I appreciate that. I'll just look to see if Councillor Stutley had anything that he felt external audit should be looking at.
Thank you for the invitation, Chair, but I don't at this stage. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you, Councillor. And I see no other indications from members. So I think that's it, Mark. I think you've got the points that we consider. Thank you very much, Mark.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers. And okay, so we'll bring that item to a close. We've fed back to Mark on that. So we shall move on to the item 7 on the agenda, which is the internal audit update, and that'll be presented by Gavin. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you, Chairman. The purpose of this report is to update members with progress against the audit plan since the November meeting of the Audit Committee. So just an overview, the plan's on track to be delivered as planned. There have been some delays in information responses, so it's not been the usual year, but I think virtually all the work's now in progress or in draft report stage at the moment. Moving on to the work that we've completed to date. In terms of the core financial systems, we've not really found any key financial key control issues in any of these. So I think from that you can draw a conclusion that the council's been showing good resilience to changes relating to COVID-19. So there's not been any significant drop off in controls, and we'll report the balance of the work later on. Just update on business grants. Obviously there's a separate paper on that at this committee meeting. We're still awaiting the results from National Fraud Initiative data matches, which will look at grant activity up to and including the end of September last year. So that will give us a flavour as to the extent of any fraud or error that has occurred to date. And to support that, we've now got a new assurance group, which the audit manager will be chairing, reviewing the risks and post-event assurance programs that we've got in place. And that will also take account of new grants that have recently been announced. So that work will continue throughout next year as well. The main report item at this committee, as was referred to previously, was the limited assurance review on waste services contract management. So I've summarised it's not summary, it's the executive summary of the report included in your papers. Just as an overview, it's not on the scale of the NMBL audit a couple of years ago. I'd probably say as a general observation, a little bit passive, the contract management, and particularly from a performance basis, it's the key finding really is there's no performance plan in place for the year, and some of the contract management stuff's not documented that closely, which doesn't give me the assurance that it's tight enough. There are a number of mitigations. Obviously, COVID-19 has affected some issues. There are some capacity issues because there's been a lot of strain on that area in relation to Project Place and the insourcing of the joint ventures, and they've also been operating without a head of service for the year, pending restructure. So I've not got anything really to add to the findings we've got there, but it's important to keep a watching brief on that. And obviously, I think the service are making arrangements to reviewing what they do in a couple of years' time when the contract needs to be relet. The section on fraud, as I've said, the National Fraud Initiative work, we should be expecting the data matches any time now. Since I drafted this report, I have had a couple of issues that have been reported to me, but neither have involved a loss to the City Council at all. We've made no payments to the two parties, and they'll probably be referred to the relevant authorities to indicate a review. Risk management, we've just completed the second quarter of the new risk management arrangements been up and running, and they've progressed really well. As you'll see it in the summer meeting when that next comes to this committee to review, there's a fluid process with Directorate Register risks, so a few of those have moved up onto the risk register, which now also includes contract management as a new risk as well. So you'll be able to see some of the planned actions around in that. I think it's too, in terms of contract management, I think it's too soon to say that there's a problem across the authority, but the Councillor Price is quite right in saying that it's something that we need to keep a watching brief on going forward. And hopefully the internal audit work will feed into the service reviews that are going on from that front. Follow-up of audit recommendations. We've cleared all the business grant recommendations, which you've got a separate report on, and we've cleared all the purchasing card audits recommendations. So in terms of the work this year, we're on top of getting those recommendations addressed. The appendix provides the high risk recommendations. 3 relate to GDPR compliance. There has been an update received on the first of those, in that all the returns from the services have now been received by the relevant department to progress the redevelopment of the information asset register, which is really key to addressing the weaknesses that we've got. So I fully expect that to be cleared by the next meeting of the committee. The housing and then the housing contract management, an update's been given by the director in the appendix, and those, as I said at the last meeting, those will be reviewed by audit in April, May of next year. So when they're due to be implemented. Okay.
Okay, Gavin, thank you very much for introducing the report. Obviously, there's some information in there for members to consider, and I'll just look around for comments, views from members on that. Okay, I've got Councillor Schmierer indicating. Councillor.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Gavin. The points that I've got kind of come from what you've already outlined. Could I just start with item 4.2, which is on page 42, so about the business support grants. I must say I was quite surprised when I read this actually, that basically it's now up to the council to do a lot more work than I thought they had to do. I thought we were in effect just the vehicle through which these grants would be dispensed, and it would be up to the National Fraud Initiative to basically go after any obviously fraudulent claims or payments. So I was just wondering sort of how the council is going to go about potentially investigating this work, what sort of amount of work the council has to do on this, and also liaising with other committees. The reason why I asked this is because there was this case quite recently about a restaurant, for example, that was operating during the lockdown, and I assume it may well have claimed for some kind of business disruption grants, and obviously there is that potential conflict there. How much has it been disrupted as a result, for example? So I was just wondering if you could maybe give me an update about that, and then I do, Chair, if I may also ask a second question once I've heard an answer to that first one, because it relates to a different matter, namely the waste services contract.
Okay. In terms of how much work, it's basically a watching brief at the moment in terms of what extra work we have to do. I'm placing a lot of reliance on the National Fraud Initiative, as you said, because I think that's the most efficient way of getting some assurance. There has been quite a lot of paperwork for the service to, I'm sure Carol and Joe would concur with this, to complete for the central government in terms of risk assessment. So there's a pretty much monthly returns that we have to complete, which give them assurance that we've got plans in place. So the best control is at source when we're doing the applications, and that's where most of the work is undertaken. So there's a balance in just making sure there's key checks. Most of those are fine. Karen and Joe could explain further than me, better than me, but in some cases it's quite technical, and they do need to do further checks on those, and it's just recording those enhanced checks, but those are done on a risk basis. In terms of the work that we're doing going forward, we're working with Carol and Joe and their team, and just assessing any that we feel might need to be referred to the fraud department for further review. So a long-winded way, it's not an exact science. I understand there has been some funding provided by the government to administer the extra checks we're doing, and again, Carol and Joe will be probably best placed to provide you with an answer on that.
Thank you, Gavin. Does that answer your question on that point, Councillor Schmierer? Would you like Carol or Joe to go further, or do you want to revisit that under the item later?
Could it make sense to just finish the item now, and in particular maybe give a bit more information about the funding that the national government is giving to councils, which you've alluded to, Gavin, for this, please?
Could Carol or Joe give Councillor Schmierer a little bit more on that? I mean, I'm sure we'll cover it a bit more in the report in a second, but Carol, Joe?
Yeah, do you want me to take that one, Joe?
Yes, please. Yeah.
We've uploaded all the data to the NFI place, and they're doing matches. So I don't know what's going to come back from those matches. I'm expecting it to come back through their portal that we use for single person discount reviews and that sort of thing. How many we'll get, we don't know. We've tried to do as many checks as we can up front, but of course fraudsters are quite notoriously clever at getting around these systems. But in terms of the funding from the government, we have had quite a lot of new burdens funding to do some of this work. One of the challenges is getting people to be able to do it, because you need people with a certain skill set. So we're kind of diverting our usual resource to be doing some of this work. But we're trying to do as many of the fraud checks as we can before we get money out the door. On this stage, I think on the first tranche, we did make payment before we had chance to do any checks because that was the government's brief. But we can come to that on the next agenda item if that's okay.
Yeah, does that answer your question, Councillor Schmira?
That does. Thank you very much for that update. May I move on to my second question, if that's okay?
Yeah, I haven't seen another member indicate, so you're happy to go on.
Yeah, so this relates to item 4.3 on page 43, which is on, in particular, the waste services contract. I think, Gavin, you called out sort of, I know this obviously is dealing with rather than the actual service provider, but the sort of the management of that service and the sort of interaction between the council and the service provider. I think you called it a little bit passive. And what I was quite concerned to read and then to hear was that there was no performance plan in place. And indeed, actually, the bullet points that you put are a matter for concern and should be a matter of concern for this committee. And I suppose also about a matter of reassurance that you guys are doing your job very well, that you've identified this potential problem. But can I ask, in your sort of professional opinion going forward, are you going to have those sort of assurances that you require to make it sort of move away from the risk that you identify in Appendix B? And especially given the fact that we're going to be taking a lot more services in-house, can we make sure that when we sort of set out sort of a plan for the audit work, audit plan for 2021-2022, that we basically make sure that we don't sort of have areas like this being left potentially for quite a few years before they get visited, and making sure that we've got the sort of policies, procedures and processes in place to make sure that the governance and the organisation of Norwich City Council is working as well as it could and should be.
Sure. So in terms of making sure that the lessons are learnt on contract management, we're going to be, you'll see from the plan coverage for next year, we're going to work closely with the business relationship and procurement manager to feed in audit themes and findings into their work, and they're developing a training program, key competencies program for officers in terms of how they manage projects going forward. So that's on one tranche. Going forward, the joint venture work is key, and that's why I've got a 3-year plan. As these come live, we will be looking, well, I have recommended we will be looking at a contract management review several months after go live date. So we're looking at in the first year of inception, and we will report on those. I say once you build, I can't envisage for the next several years it's going to be such an intrinsic part of how councils operate, and it's important to get right that we will be doing some form of audit work on the bigger contracts. I'm also discussing with the procurement manager sort of thematic reviews as well on top of these, rather than just looking at specific big contracts, looking at the lower level, middle contracts, just to ensure they're taken on. But initially we're looking at the high value, high risk contracts going forward. But it's been a theme wherever I've worked, so you're right to highlight this as a key element. But equally, we've not done enough work for me to say that this is a endemic problem across the council. But they are very keen to develop training programs to improve competencies in these areas.
Thank you, Gavin. Yes. Did you have more, Councillor Schmira?
If I
yes,
may, unless
yes.
Other councillors wish to. but specifically on this point. Yeah, I mean, obviously, by virtue of what you've just said there, Gavin, and I know we'll come on to the audit plan for next year, you've kind of highlighted and suggested there that there does need to be some more work done on this, in particular on those sort of high-level, high-risk contracts. But in particular, could I just highlight the point, I think it's the penultimate bullet point, an incentivisation scheme had been implemented in 2015. However, no evidence could be obtained that this was monitored. I mean, that was one of the things that really sort of sprung to mind and sort of had my sort of alarm bells were ringing. The fact that we have got that kind of contract, a sort of incentivization scheme, and sort of no mechanism for working out what those incentives are and how they're monitored. I assume that we're going to have more of those incentivization schemes for work that comes in-house going forward. So, I mean, I'm just wanting to get an assurance that these are going to be properly monitored going forward, in particular, as I mean, waste services is one of the statutory functions of a local authority such as Norwich. These things need to be done right, and I know it's not about the actual bin collection itself; it's about how that the sort of governance of that scheme. But it doesn't. I think that was something that certainly sprung to mind and caused some alarm when I read this report.
Yeah, no, absolutely spot on. It's not of the level of the NMBL work, which was appalling, basically, in terms of lack of monitoring on that. Well, just looking at it from afar, it does seem that incentivisation put in this contract was a little bit weak. But there are other factors. There's a lot of legislative changes in the service area, and I know we've got Louise here as director. I know they're doing quite a lot of work in this area in terms of what they need going forward from this contract, but I do think that's a significant area which the authority really needs to address, is making sure we've got a really tight rein and making sure that if we're in these contracts, this one's been going for quite some time and we spend quite a lot of money on it, so we need to leverage a mechanism for getting efficiencies and incentivisation to improve services going forward. And that's a common theme across all major contracts. And it's certainly something that I think the leadership team are aware of and want to address going forward.
Just let Annabelle in at that point. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you, Chair. As part of the review work we're doing as an organisation, we've set up a series of service reviews, and there's one that I'm going to be leading and overseeing, which is called Driving Value from the Supply Chain. And it's exactly this context, picking up the issues that Gavin's raised through the audit reports, actually just looking at our forward plan and commissioning approach in relation to how we actually procure services in future. But with that, we will be bringing online all of the contracts that are coming up and looking at 2 years out where the BIFA contract currently is, for example, and making sure that we're planning ahead. And I know Louise has already got that on her sort of future priorities to make sure we're looking at that well in advance of the contract review date. So there's a lot of work that's going to happen in the coming year. I'm just signing off the scope. I haven't actually finalised it yet. And I'll welcome your comments here and I'll give that consideration in how we take that scope forward.
Thank you, Annabelle. Does that answer your query, Councillor Schmerich? Yeah, that's great. So I'm just looking around for other members. Any points from any members at all about the internal audit quarter report?
Chair, Councillor McCartney-Gray raised an issue about equalities.
Yeah. Do you want to just touch on that, Councillor?
Yes, so we've got the report coming next to the next audit committee. It says, with an action plan. I would just like us to bear in mind that obviously it's up to the committee, but I would actually like us to, once we've had the action plan at the next meeting, for it to come back in, say, 6 or 9 months' time, so we can see how that's progressed. This is obviously a statutory area, and obviously an area that I take a great interest in. So, and that's where sort of my thoughts are coming from that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Councillor. I think Gavin wants to indicate, but I'll just come in and say, obviously, we could, at that next meeting, you could make a recommendation.
Yeah.
I wouldn't normally, I would envisage the key findings of the report once it's been agreed, obviously reporting June. I wouldn't normally publish the action plan with that. There will be an action plan underpinning that audit work, but I think if you see the findings first and then take it from there.
And I assume that Councillor McCartney-Gray could request to view that action plan if she wished. Yeah. So you can liaise with Gavin about that.
Yeah, there's no problem with that. It's just like routine.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Thank you, Councillor. Just looking around one more time, one quick scan. Councillor Schmierer.
Apologies, Chair. I seem to be monopolising this item. Could I just draw the committee's attention to page 47, please, of this report, in particular the item on contract management, housing repairs and responsive maintenance. As a ward councillor, I get quite a few issues about work not being done necessarily to the right level, and so I wasn't that surprised to see this item here actually, and I understand of course that it does write that you are doing a review of NNBL and Gasway by the 31st of March 2021. So my first question is, how is that review coming along, given the fact that that's sort of less than a month away now, and what actions are being taken to ensure that residents get the kind of services that they want and deserve, and that the council gets the value for money that it wants and deserves, please?
Yeah, well, just I'll start to pick up, but what I would sort of summarise. What I mean, that really that's the question there really sits with Louise in some ways. But what I would expand that by saying is that from an audit perspective, Gavin's role, I guess, is to identify the issues and show any mitigations. But you know, I mean, if Louise or Gavin have any comments to what Councillor Schmierer said, I'd take them now.
Well, just from me, we've reported the findings, which was it was a detailed paper at the last committee meeting. Part of the issues were getting a completed action plan in place. That's in place for November, so the service are. Louise might be able to update on the service against those recommendations. But from an internal audit perspective, we will be following up on a self-assessed basis where they are and looking for evidence that they've addressed the recommendations we've made in the original report.
Thank you. And Louise?
Thank you, Chair. I can report that those actions are progressing, and we'll report those to the audit team in April when required, and then they'll come back to you for a progress report following that.
Okay, thank you, Louise. I think Councillor Schmierer has exhausted himself with those questions, and I just quickly look around and it's no other indications. But what I'll do is, at that point, obviously I wanted to invite members first, but you know, so just to draw just a few points. First of all, thank you, Gavin, for putting together the report. You know, obviously there are concerns around the waste contract. You know, there are, you know, you say it's an executive summary, so obviously there is more detail. You also say it's not such a deep delve as the NNBL, so you know that shows that there is some limited scope on the work that's undertaken. You know, what I would say is, you know, the passive management is an interesting kind of phrase, particularly when you say, you know, one of the points is the incentive scheme implemented in 2015. However, no evidence could be obtained that this was monitored. I mean, with mitigation like COVID, etc., that's 6 years. You know, it's surprising that nothing has happened in 6 years.
I think it's the nature of the incentive. Most of it was up front, so it's in an annual rebate, and it's a two. Those might be able to. It's quite technical. It's a two-tiered thing. So some of the rebates generated on further efficiency improvements, we couldn't see that had happened or was happening. So which is why I've alluded to the fact that these incentivisation arrangements need to be quite robust going forward for longer contracts. I don't know if Louise wants to.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm in the technical detail of it. I'm not absolutely certain on, but I mean we can check that out and we can provide an update.
I mean, it's not something where you're just going to get figures and check them off, and it does rely on, it's reliant on service development and service efficiency improvement. So it's very much different from the NNBL, which is purely figures on a profit share basis. But it's very technical area and it's very difficult to get right on longer contracts, and you're dealing with a third party, so it's got to be a win-win situation. But I think my comments would be that the incentivisation was a little bit weak.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I mean the point three, no evidence could be obtained that service performance data provided by the contractor was independently checked and verified by the council. But that's just a simple kind of ownership of contract responsibility there, that and so that's a really basic area. When you could put that with the NNBL, when you look at the kind of housing repairs weaknesses, points like didn't undertake any testing or receive any independent verification regarding the accuracy of reports. I mean, those are very basic and fundamental lessons. So my point is, I think that's good that we've identified that. I think that what the CLT are doing now, working with internal audit, is the right way forward in terms of consultancy, having those levels of scrutiny and check, and having areas of responsibility assigned to people mean that we should avoid that situation from manifesting in the future. But to have a look at sort of 2-3 contract areas and to find quite serious issues a little bit in all of them makes me feel that we need greater assurance as a committee that all contracts that we have in place already are, we need to kind of know where we stand on all of those at the moment, and whether or not the council is kind of implementing those contracts well or getting value for money, and are those contracts actually being managed. So when you say that we've got contract management coming up, a lot of the contract management focus on the external audit plan, which we'll get to, works as rightly as the consultancy process for the next part of insourcing, and also some insurance compliance work, etc., around environment coming in. But we're not looking at any wider or any other existing kind of contracts which are still kind of running now. So where do I get the assurance if I get 3 contracts back with some major holes in it? Where's the assurance that this is not the case across the board? Because you said at this stage you don't think that this is necessarily systemic. I kind of don't subscribe to that. I'm getting 3 reports and 3 sets of evidence contrary to that. So what's your view on that? And because I feel that that's an area that should be in the audit plan for next year, as well as the work that you've put forward on contract management.
Well, I did discuss this with the business relationship and procurement manager as to whether we do thematics, and I have discussed this with individual directors as a key question in terms of what's your big contracts, how those keeping the rate. So they've not come up in terms of director input. They've not come up as a risk from their areas. Speaking to the procurement manager, she said she would value initially some consultancy time rather than assurance work, working with her and her team to develop competencies, develop training, and I think further from that, out of that, we would be maybe looking at some thematic reviews. I mean, it's just not doable to look at every single contract in the council. We are looking at we have got a programme of looking at the big ones over a period of time, over a 2 or 3 year period. It may be going forward we do 2 big contracts a year, but I'm not unhappy with the level of work we're doing at the moment. Obviously, we need to keep a watching brief, but I'm very, having come in here just for a year, I just don't want to make a sweeping generalisation on contracts. But going back to the performance issue, I think that has been recognised as well as another pronged attack. So there's a lot of work that the leadership team are doing on performance management and improving that, and that's still being refined. And all this needs to be more vigorously informed. So it's not just siloed with individual contracts. There's quite a lot of good governance work in its infancy at the moment, which I think maybe would be useful for the committee to get some sort of assurance when that's bedded down, so you can see how all the constituent parts work into that. So audit's not just your sole focus of assurance. The performance management should be one of the biggest areas to look at.
Thank you, Gavin. Did I see you indicating, Annabelle, were you indicating Councillor McCartney-Gray? No.
No, I was just, I got thrown out and I was trying to get back in.
No problem.
And it was just that.
Yeah, got you. Annabelle, did you indicate there?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to that piece that Gavin's referenced in relation to identifying the need to do some more work around support to the organisation. So as part of the senior management review, it's been identified that there'll be a new leadership programme. And as part of that leadership programme, we'll be looking at key skill sets that we require. And obviously contract management is a key one for us. If we're looking though at what Gavin's referencing in relation to what's in its infancy, there will be a new shareholder panel in relation to the new wholly owned company. So you've got, for example, environmental services coming across, and there'll be quarterly meetings on those. We're bringing in Norwich Regeneration Limited into that framework as well. So again, quarterly shareholder meetings, of which the board will be presenting their current financial positions, performance, health and safety, all of those good governance things on a quarterly basis. So that's being put in place. And again, as part of what we'll be doing as scoping for this contract review and this driving value from the supply chain, we will be doing a refresh of the contract database, looking at that forward plan, as I mentioned earlier. And as part of that, we will pick out where we believe the high priority contracts are. So it isn't something that we'll be able to do all in one go and give you a position statement, but we will be risk assessing those contracts. And as Gavin's already covered off, we've covered off two of the biggest contracts in the last two audit reports that you've received at the audit committee, and we'll be taking that a stage further. But hopefully, again, I'm picking up the performance board that goes forward, of which we'll be looking at all of the audit recommendations and the performance, which will pick up contracts as well. And again, this is kind of all new, starting to move forward for next financial year, but there's a lot of good governance going in place that will help us report through to yourselves and give you a bit more assurance as well as to how these things are progressing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Annabelle. And I absolutely kind of understand about how we are putting better, more robust systems in place. And I think that when we've looked at those and that work has taken place, will be the point where the committee will have that assurance. I think it's fair to say that we can't have that assurance now. And, and I think Gavin alludes to the fact that perhaps there could be more than one contract looked at. So it would be good for the committee to receive a report about where the council identify where it wants to be looking at and how it arrived at those priorities of contracts. I mean, as I've said, we've looked at a few contracts and we've seen, that there are gaps in some of the performance or the structure of those, and that's fair enough, but we've seen three, we've got three. So where that leads me to think is it fills me with concern around sort of spending in HRA. We've done a lot of work, a lot of good work over the years in improving the standards of our council properties. Obviously, we've used a lot of contractors for that, and we've spent a lot of money, and we've been very proud of the money that we have spent. I worry that we haven't have had value for money for that throughout, and I would like to know that we're getting good value for money in any spending we're kind of going forward. So I would suggest that is an area of urgency to kind of look at in that respect, in terms of procurement and spending, in the HRA, improving our council dwellings. So I don't know if there's any views from Louise or Annabelle that point that I raised. But I think, the quicker we can look at the bigger contracts, the better.
I mean, that's a separate issue to contract management in terms of NNBL, of course. So I mean, I'm not really clear on specifically what you're asking for there, Chair. So is this...
Well, okay, so what I mean is that obviously what we're doing is we're spending vast amounts of money on procurement, and there'll be, and so actually what this actually does, sorry, so I'm mixing my points a little bit. At the previous quarterly report we received in November, we had the report on the policies and procedures. Now, we had a very extensive agenda with the statement of accounts, and I note from the minutes of today, of that meeting in today's agenda, that we didn't discuss the findings. It seems that we didn't discuss the findings at all of the policies and procedures. And to summarise that for some members, and there's a point to this, on page 16 of that document, what it concluded was that the council does not have a review schedule for policies or any guidance on frequency of reviews. It also made the point nearly half of the policies reviewed as part of the audit had no evidence of being reviewed in the last 5 years, though it's recognised that some of these require only a light touch review. It goes on to say that work is currently underway through the corporate governance group to ensure that existing policies are owned, updated and reviewed where necessary. And I'd appreciate if Annabelle can give us an update of how that's going. But this goes back to the sort of, you know, the procurement process that we go through the HRA is, you know, if we don't have the kind of underlying policies and procedures in place, or we're not designing kind of contracts well when we are designing our kind of procurement processes, you know, I'm really concerned about the kind of the value for money. So yeah, so it's not so much contract management, I suppose, you know, procurement, it kind of stands alone, but it kind of, when you get these alerts that are just like things are kind of not, you know, being monitored or enforced correctly, then I get really worried when we're spending a lot of money. So I guess that's my point, but maybe I'll let Annabelle in to respond to the policies bit, and maybe Louise comment on, you know, how do we know that procurement is value for money for the council?
Thank you, Chair. So again, as part of this performance board, it is actually all about delivery as well. So it's about ensuring that what we're focusing on and the outcomes we're achieving are linked back to our policies and our strategies. So what's actually happened, so you're all aware as an audit committee, is the governance group is being merged into the new performance and delivery board, which I'm chairing. And fundamentally, policies and strategies are on there. So what we're about to do is to launch our corporate planning cycle. We've been working on that as our first key deliverable from the group, and fundamentally we'll be sharing with the organisation where we believe our key policies and strategies are, and then what the timelines are to review those as a priority. But as you're aware, we've started at the top. We've had the corporate plan just approved through Cabinet and Council, and we've also got the medium-term financial strategy, which covers the capital strategy, because I know you mentioned, Chair, earlier about capital and ensuring we've got a clear direction of travel as to how we approve our capital spend. So all of that was done as part of the budget setting process. Now, within this performance board, and boy, it's going to keep us busy, we are looking at delivery as well. And through that delivery, we'll be looking at the project plans in relation to milestones, and that will include the procurement timelines. So we have procurement on this board as well. And what we know, and we will see going forward, and it is already in place, is there is a very clear requirement from our contract procedure rules in relation to how we go to the market for particular contracts. Everyone is required to work within that. We do have a small exemption policy, and we have used that a little bit more recently, but that's been more to do with short-term contract changes just for the transition of NCSL, the wholly owned company, and how we work with them to make sure they've got a smooth transfer for the 1st of April. But there are some very clear rules, and any exemption in relation to changing our approach to procurement has to be signed off by myself, and then it is reviewed by the monitoring officer. So again, there's a very clear check in place with that, and I always write on the bottom of there, yes, I accept the reason this time, but don't come back again for another exemption. So we are again making sure officers are learning and understanding that they have to be planning ahead from a procurement perspective to make sure we don't find ourselves in any kind of exemptions. But that exemptions, as I say, is quite low level. We're not talking anything, you know, when I signed off today was for 80,000. It's 30,000 over the limit. So we're not talking big changes there, but it is just helping the company come on board and make sure that we've got the services we need for the 1st of April. So I think there's an awful lot there that has been in place. What we're doing is bringing it together in a different way, which will have a better oversight of it. But I don't think I can underestimate the work that I know we need to do with that contract database looking forward, and therefore looking at the performance and then seeing how we're getting the value out of the contracts. The procurement side, though, I think is there, Chair. I think we do very clearly get value for money at the point at which we award the contract. It's this issue of monitoring and managing going forward that we need to develop.
Yeah, and in fact, no, thank you for that, Annabelle, because that's the point I really wanted to pick up. It's you buy 50,000 windows or whatever from somebody, but who's going in, checking the quality of these windows, checking they're installing them, checking the waste numbers, and actually making sure we're getting value for money in that respect as well. So that's something I think is something we're highlighting there that does need looking at as we go forward. And just finally, and you picked up on it, it's the capital spend projects. Obviously, it's really great when we do have capital spend, and it enhances the city. But I mean, I've had issues raised with me by different councillors, and so is there a capital spend policy in existence? Do we have a capital spend policy, a procedure in place for deciding things, or do we just simply make it up as we go along?
Chair, I think you'll understand that I won't say we make it up as we go along. We the corporate planning cycle, which is what we're now calling it and launching, is that cycle of which we look at our financial position going forward. So as much as we've just set the budget at full council in February, we are already now about to launch next year's budget process for the MTFS. As part of that, all services are asked to look at both their asset portfolios as well as their general fund budgets and their HRA budgets. And within that, what they're allowed to do is to put what we call an outline business case together that gives us an overview, or opening brief, we call it here, apologies for using the wrong term. Call it an opening brief, where the service leads will put together that outline of what the investment would be. We require them to tell us how much capital investment they'd need, what the revenue ongoing implications would be, and ideally whether we're going to invest to save if we're investing in particular services. And that is done at an opening brief level to start with. We're looking at those, the plan is this year to be looking at those before the summer break. Then we'll get an overview as to where that feels from a service perspective first internally, then we'll be talking to members about the direction of travel, and then we'll be working up through the summer more detailed plans that give us a really good costing on what the outcomes will be and the delivery timelines that then fall into the budget process in October time. That is then what forms the basis of the proposals that go forward for the draft capital programme. And as you know, that it goes through from December through to February in those approval cycles through Cabinet and full council. So there's quite a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes throughout the year. And literally we are going to CLT on the 17th with our plan and process for next year and guidance. And we'll be launching again for next financial year.
No, thank you for that, Annabelle. I see Gavin's indicating. So just to come in, just as a point of clarity, that kind of that opening brief procedure that we're implementing using now, to confirm, because audit is a retrospective process as well, is that wasn't what we were doing before, though. Is that right?
No, just to clarify, we were doing that. What we're trying to do this year is bring the timeline forward a little bit so that we're actually starting earlier, because what we're trying to do is to move the whole consultation cycle a little bit earlier so that we've got more time before we're launching into the January decisions. So we're starting earlier this year. The process is exactly what was run last year, but what we're doing is a very detailed and linked document that everybody can see how all of the strategies come together, what all the guidance is in one place, and therefore whether it's performance or it's capital or it's just general financial management, it will all be in one document so the organisation understands the process going forward.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So that's the process. It's moving forward. We did it last year. Were we doing that in previous years? I mean, I know that's before you, but was that the process? Has that always been the standing process?
I believe that process has been in for a while, but if I could ask Hannah to come in.
Yes, certainly for the last sort of 2 or 3 years, we've been going through that opening brief process and refining that obviously to what it is now.
Okay, thank you so much for that, and I'll let Gavin in at that point. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just to confirm, Chairman, that we are looking at capital programme management as part of next year's internal audit plan. So I'd certainly, that could go in several different directions, but I'd certainly look at how the programme's put together, the affordability of it, and how that is then managed and monitored going forward, and our exposure to various risks, etc.
Thank you for that point, Gavin. I didn't quite see that there. But you can show us when we get onto that point of the agenda. Okay, so I think that's definitely plenty enough from me. So if there are no other points from members or from officers, we will certainly note Gavin's, I assume, last quarterly report with us, and so I think we'll have on record our thanks to Gavin for all the work that he's done with us over this year as well, and I'm sure I speak for the committee on that. So thank you, Gavin, for another excellent report. Okay, so we will move on to item 8 of the agenda, which Joe and Carol have been so patiently, kindly waiting, and I assume that Carol and Joe will lead on it.
Right, yeah, yes, thank you, Chair. I'll introduce the report, and then obviously any questions we'll be happy to answer between us. This report sets out all the processes, controls and the audit findings of the, relating to the payment of all the business rates grants. Well, I say all, the audit actually related to the payment of the first 3. The NFI data, as Gavin mentioned previously, isn't yet available, unfortunately. So the report, it provides a summary of all the different grants we've had to pay out and the period of time they were in operation. It's quite complex, so we put that little chart in there for you, and actually there's more grants to come from April, as we know. So early on, the government's first approach was to get the payments out and ask questions afterwards and check them after. So the first payments we did were on that basis, but then we did adopt an application-based approach after those initial payments, and we developed a good process between Revenues, Finance and IT. So for the tranche 1 grants, they were based on business rates data. They all related to being the business subject or being subject to certain reliefs. We checked they were all still trading, either through remote intelligence or doing visits, and we made cross checks to make sure we weren't making duplicate payments and the businesses were eligible for them. With a series of reconciliations always took place, risk assessments completed, and obviously there were fraud alerts coming to us, which we then reacted to. So the audit scope included a review of the risk assessments, the sampling of some payments, fraud reporting and recovery. So the findings are summarised in the report and all the actions agreed there. At the time of writing the report, we completed some of the actions and we were making good progress with the others. So if there's any questions, pleased to take any.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Joe. I'll just look round. Members have obviously had the report to consider, and I wonder if we can make sure microphones are off. And I see that Councillor Stuteley is indicating. Councillor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I don't necessarily have a question, but more of a comment on this. And I would like to congratulate staff in this department for the work that they carried out under really difficult circumstances. So just basically, thank you to all the staff in the department. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Driver.
Yeah, could someone just tell me on page, I'll just have a quick look again. Page 55, F. Could you tell me what those 5 overpayments were and how we're proceeding to get the money back?
Carol, are you able to elaborate on that one? Are you talking about the checks on the 4 fraudulent cases?
Yeah, let's say 5 overpayments need to be recovered, which is processing.
Yeah.
I mean, why were they paid in the first place? Was there fraud involved? How much money are we talking about, and how are we applying to get this money back? I mean, do these people just disappear, then we lose it, or have we got to take it back through court, or
No,
we have to pay out money that way?
it was our fault. It's been a fairly manual process. We've been working on spreadsheets and things like that. So we did early on do some duplicate payments. We asked for some back, and some paid, and some decided they didn't want to give us it back. But all of that money has been recovered because they had ongoing entitlement to new grants, and we deducted it from those new grants. So we have had all the money back.
So the only reason we got back for is the government brought in new grants because the virus actually carried on longer than what they thought. Yeah.
Yeah, on those particular ones, that's true. If they hadn't paid, then they would have received an invoice and a demand for the payment, and then we would have potentially had to go through a recovery process. Any that we pay, that we do pay incorrectly, whether it be our fault or whether they tell us something that's not true, ultimately, if they don't pay, we can pass them back to the government, and they will then pursue prosecution or consider prosecution. But as in this particular cases, we got all that money back, so that's all settled, and a lesson learned, and we a little bit slightly different process off the back of that error. So,
Do you think this was just people trying it on, or do you think that was a mistake by them as well?
those 5 payments were our fault. It was an internal error, which we have fixed, so we won't be doing that again. It was just a process that was very early in the process. But we have had quite a lot of people trying to get money that they are not entitled to, or arguing that they should be getting something that we wouldn't be giving under the rules that the government provided.
Okay, but we're still doing well. We got 95% we're actually paid out and stuff. So we're on top on it. So all the checks you're doing, they're done really quick, then, yeah?
We've done them as quickly as we can. We've asked for lots of proof of their validity, and we've had bank statements from everybody to make sure that we knew that it was the right person that we were paying, so that the liability matched the bank account, matched the payment. And we also were looking for proof of trading within the dates that they had to be trading. We hold quite a lot of lease documents and things like that. We checked Companies House. We're now checking a system called Spotlight, which checks the bank account, which is a government tool that we've been able to use, and NFI. So we're now able to do more checks than we were in the first round, because it was all very new and the government were trying to put things in place, as were we. But the first tranche of payments that went out, we didn't have a chance to do any checks on, but we then introduced an application process, so they had to make declarations and provide lots of proofs that we could then verify. The restaurant that was alluded to earlier on, we didn't pay. We'd already got that on our radar, because they couldn't provide the proofs that were required to prove.
Can I just ask, Chair, all this work we're doing to pay these out, is the government giving us money, or is this coming out of our council tax money, if you know what I mean, out of our coffers, to do all the checking all the time, all the staff resourcing and paying out? I mean, are we actually paying for this as a city?
No, the government have given us new burdens funding to pay all the grants out.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely. Thank you for those questions, Councillor Driver. And just to pick up on what you said there, Carol. So you said that there were actually 5 payments that were refused to be paid back. Could you confirm how many in those early and difficult days, how many missed payments were made? Because you said some were paid back as well. So how many in total was there missed payments?
There was just those 5. Okay. There were 4 that we paid, which turned out to be fraudulent, but they were stopped before the bank stopped those going through. That was on Greg's. It was a national fraud, and they provided us with bank statements, but they were forgeries. So that never went through. We never paid that money. So those are the only frauds that we know we tried to pay, but were stopped.
No, well, no, thank you for that. I would like to reiterate what Councillor Stuteley said, particularly at the very beginning of lockdown, where none of us knew where we stood, and we had all entered a very strange and new world. For people to be able to continue to function and keep the council going at that very, very difficult early days, you know, must be commended. And of course, the work that has taken place through this report shows that as the situation has developed, so has the robust systems to alleviate any potential errors and frauds. So that's excellent. While we were talking about all of that, and it reminded me, my mind went back to the beginning of COVID, and it actually was a point for Mark at EY, who has kindly stayed with us throughout the meeting, and I very much appreciate his time. But it was when we were talking about areas to be looking at, and in your report from last year, when it's clearly identified that the council will have to have some considerance to losses of income, and also the kind of medium and impacts on the medium-term financial strategy. I think I wanted to highlight to Mark at this point that those areas that I would say to consider to be looking at is also that kind of differences in that kind of expected generated income, and I don't know how the council gets its assurance around that, and kind of where its policies are kind of mitigating to protect itself over the medium-term financial strategy. So I'm sorry to sort of cut across different items, but I just thought it was worth bringing that there. So if Mark is happy to just acknowledge that as another area for the council, and I think he is, I'll park that idea. I'll go back to this item, and I would say that for me, I very much appreciate all that. I did notice point G on page 55 that there had been limited use made of Spotlight, which is a government grants management and counter fraud function for limited companies only, which may highlight areas of possible risk. And then obviously when we looked at, in order to address the findings, I couldn't see as effectively any kind of implementation of that. So I don't know, on point G, if you could elaborate on what those risks were, maybe how many sort of limited companies and why we didn't use that policy. That would be my point of interest on this item, please, Carol.
Okay, we got access to Spotlight later in the process, and there is a premium service that we've now subscribed to as well. This was all in the very early days of the retail, health, hospitality, leisure, the small business grant and discretionary business grants. We didn't have access to it at that point. It took us a while to actually get the government to get us into that, because obviously they'd been inundated with applications. So it took a little while before we could actually get to be able to use it. But we do use it now for all the new grants that we're paying out. So yeah, it's of limited value, but occasionally it does provide us with an extra level of protection.
That's good. That's good assurance. And I see Gavin would like to come in. Gavin?
Yeah, I concur with what Carol says. It provides assurance in a limited area. But just as background, Spotlight's a very new system. So it's not something that we haven't subscribed over a number of years that we should have done. It's only recently been introduced.
Yeah, thank you for that point of clarity on that, Gavin. So I'll just look around the room to see if there are any other points for members. Councillor Stuteley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's worth probably pointing out that we've not had very much help from the government on this, and I understand that a lot of the guidance was issued extremely late. And one example I am aware of was payments to licensed premises, I believe, and others around Christmas time, and guidance was issued on Christmas Eve, I believe, but all payments were completed by the end of the day. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. We held back. One of our officers stayed back specifically to try to get that payment run out, and every wet-led pub that we were confident qualified got a payment put through on that day. Some that we didn't know whether or not they were wet lead, because that was a new term to us. But obviously the ones that we could be confident about, we got those paid, along with the Tier 4 grant. So yes.
Well, I would say thank you for the Chair of Licensing for highlighting that happened. And also what I would say is that shows real dedication. That would have made a real difference to a lot of people's Christmases. So thank you for that level of work on behalf of the council. So thank you for highlighting that. I don't see any other members indicating. So I believe the report, I will double check, is to note the report, and I'm going back, note the report. So that report is duly noted, and we thank Joe and Carol for joining us to explain the report as well. So thank you for that. And so we'll move on to the final item today, which is, I'll get the number right, 9, and it is, the recommendation is to endorse the draft internal audit plan. So I will hand over to Gavin to introduce the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So as the report indicates, this plan has been put together following a number of interviews I've had with directors and key heads of service. We've also got an operational risk register in place, which is more fit for purpose, and with reference to some of the corporate plan and priorities and development going forward. So I would hope you'll see a significant difference from the original audit plans, certainly at the start of the year, that this is a much more strategically focused audit coverage. So I'll just briefly reiterate the conversations I've had with you early on in the year. We're very much moving away from a compliance-based approach, not exclusively, but moving to a much more risk-based audit approach, which is really what a modern internal audit section should look like. So there's quite a lot more linkage to the risk register as it stands at the moment and some of the corporate priorities. I've maintained that at the Chief Executive's request, a lot of the work that's valued the most is the consultancy work. So that's been maintained and built upon. Key financial coverage reflects relatively low risk in recent years in terms of audit findings. That is the compliance part of the plan, but we'll work on 100 days a year at the moment. There is scope to possibly look at that going forwards and maybe take a bolder approach to reducing that, but 100 days seems right at the moment. And within that coverage, it's very much risk-based. So if we do look at something every year, we won't be looking at the same parts of the system every year. For example, payroll is quite wide scope areas of review. In terms of resources, the plan will have to be flexible because it's not being finalised in terms of the future management of the section for next year. So I'm working on the brief of pretty much similar resource we've got at the moment, albeit scaled up, to move away from compliance work to risk-based audit work. So we've discussed these already, the key themes. I think contract management is reflected in the plan. I would reiterate as well that although there's in the table there's 3 line items on contract management, there are other items as well where I think that approach is embedded as well. So you've got social housing delivery, for example, and the management of the town's deal funding and how we develop that programme going forward. So I think there is quite a lot of coverage in terms of that. As I alluded to earlier, we've got capital programme management and some of the key financial systems and health and safety as well. All those can be traced to the risk register going forward. I've got a programme of IT work which will need to be reviewed. I think I normally work on a needs assessment basis, so I'm sort of doing this a bit on the fly, but certainly we'll be looking at IT governance going forward and then seeing where the key risk areas for the authority are after that. So I've think really that hopefully that covers off what I've been talking about over the last 2 committee meetings and reflects the direction the authority's going. Happy to take any questions.
No, thank you, Gavin. I'll let in Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Gavin, for outlining your report. On in the table in 7.1, sort of scanning down some of those days required, that they all seem quite reasonable. But there's one that stands out for me is it feels like there are more days allocated to it than I would have thought, given where it sits in the organisation, and that's IR35 compliance. Do we really have a high number of contractors and agency staff who would come under IR35? Because in terms of days, it's sort of up there with things like a new housing system, which seems to me to be a much more meatier sort of service area to have a look at. So is IR35 really a big thing for this authority? Thank you.
Okay, that's a fair challenge. The new housing systems consultancy time, so there's a difference between actually doing the work. I put 10 days as a default audit time. It would take a minimum of 5 days, I would imagine, on previous evidence. I'm not cited on the extent that that's an issue for the council, but we'll take that on board. But it's very much finger in the wind at the moment. But it'll take as long as it takes. We're not going to overdo it, but yeah, it's that is a compliance-based piece of work that we've not done before. So part of that will, depending on who's doing it, will involve some prep work on that as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. So just looking around for any other members' comments on the draft audit plan. So not seeing anything at the moment, thank you for this. And yes, I had not seen that you had the capital programme management assurance work down on there. So I very much welcome seeing that as a part of the plan, Gavin. Again, you do have that Towns Fund and the Social Housing Delivery Programme, which is assurance and consultancy work. I would refer back to the point about the contract management, where it seems very much focused on the insourcing and what goes live on April and what goes on after that. And I think rightly so that there is work on that, but it does feel like that there are potential other areas of contract management that are effectively maybe not being looked at. So I would like to challenge you on that. I notice you've got consultancy contingency. So I assume that is for an additional 15 days for the joint venture insourcing, taking up to a total of 60 days now. Okay, so if you could elaborate on what you meant by that. What I would say on my final point, really, I can see Councillor Schmier is indicating. I'll take him just a second. I'll let Gavin come back on my points. But for me, with the work that you did in the last quarter around policies and procedures, and the fact that they haven't been reviewed in many places for 5 years, and that there isn't a process in place as of yet, and Annabelle has offered us a pathway moving forward. It felt like to me that there should be some days on this audit plan that reflect that as a kind of a going concern of the council and of this committee to see how we kind of see those changes happen around policy and procedures. I think policies and procedures should be something that's looked at. I think that there should be more contract management work done on different contracts. I'm interested to know what your consultant contingency is. The final point I will make is I did put points to the Constitution Working Party to suggest changes to the Constitution, which suggested that the Audit Committee were included in the process of setting the internal audit plan. Currently, that's something that's negotiated between the Internal Audit Officer and the CLT, rather than us having a plan foisted upon us to accept or to ask for changes. I think it would make for much better governance if the council worked with the audit committee before presenting it a report. The chair of that, which was is the leader of the council. I think what did he say is let's see. Well, Councillor Kendrick, a member of Resources, took the view that the governance arrangements were in place to bring to attention any weaknesses in corporate governance. Thank you for that. The chair said that it was the role of the corporate leadership team to determine the internal audit work programme. The audit committee's role was to monitor it. So, you know, likewise, the committee could approve additional resources if there was an area of concern, but the day-to-day management of internal audit was the function of the corporate leadership team. That I disagree with the leader in the council, and I believe that we should have a greater input into the annual audit plan. So I just wanted to get that across, that I did that on behalf of the committee, in my views, for a better working committee. But Gavin, if you could respond to the addition of consultancy, my point about contract management in other areas, and a going concern on policy and procedures.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, the additional consultancy was following a conversation I had with the business relationship and procurement manager, where I was offering up a thematic type of reviews on contract management, and she said she would value at this stage a change in audit approach. Outside of that, so that would be supporting her and a team in terms of developing training and maybe assessing risks on contracts and how the register's put together. So that will inform future work. So I've not fleshed that out yet, but it's certainly separate from the joint venture work. And as with all this consultancy, it won't take necessarily 45 days on joint ventures. It's a fluid resource. There is a lot of consultancy time in the plan. If that doesn't come off, or if there's a change in the level of resources, then we've got a reserve list of projects to cover. So in terms of the contract management, it's a fair point. I could do ad infinitum contract management work. Again, I'd rather have a more considered approach, which will come out of the consultancy work. So that'll inform further work going forward. I think we're hitting the big stuff at the moment. I appreciate there's always a balance in terms of looking at the big contracts and then what's happening further down beneath. But the separate audits in terms of procurement and contract letting, which we've looked at relatively recently. So particularly on things like contract extensions and contract letting, in the previous 2 or 3 years, the compliance work that's taken place hasn't indicated significant issues. So I think the issue that we really need to look at is how we're actively managing contracts and performance management going forward. But I'll certainly take that on board as a theme and keep the plan flexible. And it may well be if we have problems going forward with, hopefully not, with the environmental services joint venture work that we're looking at, then we can look at other stuff for the second half of the year. Policy and procedures, we've looked at the last 2 years. So I'm not of the view that we've said what we've said. I don't think there's anything more that we can say. There are other avenues that we're looking at through some of the governance boards in place to ensure that the recommendations are actioned appropriately. We will follow that up to make sure that has happened. I am aware it is happening. Certainly, the 2 of the biggest strategies are being reviewed at the moment, so that informs going forward. I think if we were going to do further work on that, I would rather, for example, look at asset management strategy as one audit rather than a broad compliance audit and policies and procedures, because I don't think I've got much more to say on that other than having a proper schedule and that being as part of our governance processes. Further to that as well, we've got the annual governance information gathering process, which will be going out to directors and all heads of services in April, which will form the basis of the annual governance statement for next year, but well, for this year, looking backwards. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it'd be useful there to have an addendum table of the corporate governance policies, so you can see what the core policy is, who's the leading officer, what's the approval process, and then when's it been last reviewed and when's it next reviewed. It's as simple as that, really, going forward. And so I don't think there's any technical more work that we can do other than reiterate what we've done in the past.
Okay, well, thank you, Gavin. I think that's a fair point. I know Councillor Schmirer is eager to jump in. I think that addition to the governance statement document would be welcomed by the committee, and so I hope that you pass that on to and I hope that's duly noted that that has been suggested as a addition to that document. I think it's quite interesting that you say about, if you were looking anywhere, it would be asset management strategy. I know that this is an area that the council will be focusing a lot of its work on, and so actually, you know, that would be a really good and important area to complement that work. So obviously that's not formalised in this agreement. Was that discussed with CLT as an area that you wanted to look at or potentially look at? And is it something that we could recommend now?
They're reviewing the contract, the asset management strategy at the moment. It's being overhauled, so it's something that I will put on as a note for future audit work as a key element. But it's got to be finalised and bedded down, I think, going forwards. It's something that I think would warrant an early look at.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't say it should actually be a consultancy work now while that work is undertaken. You're actually talking about doing it as a process after. I think Annabelle would like to come in.
It's a fluid resource. I mean, yeah, I mean that element. If it's deemed that they want an audit input to that, I think that'd be quite useful, or to get some oversight of the draft.
Annabelle.
Yeah, so we have appointed a senior responsible officer for this, and fundamentally the asset management review has been scoped. CLT have signed it off. The workshops are already started, and I do think it's really important that we let that go to a certain point of which we can then bring audit in to sit alongside that before we get to the final sign off of the strategy, which is the approach we're now taking, and not doing post audits, ensuring that audit come in at the appropriate point and can engage in that process. But it's all kicked off. Asset management is one of our big priorities next year. It's really important for me from a medium-term financial strategy perspective as well, and that has already, started and well underway.
Yeah, that's excellent. Gavin?
You can just add to it, it's always a balance between getting assurance work and consultancy work. So I want to avoid having a plan of just consultancy input. We would do it on an ad hoc basis. It might not be a line-by-line approach, but certainly, yeah, I mean, when I first came out, the asset management strategy was out of date. That's the first thing that alarmed me with some of the activities going on. But that's also an issue that was highlighted up front from the relevant heads of service.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gavin. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but that process is underway, as Annabelle said. And so actually during this cycle, there will be a point where internal audit will engage with that. So although that's not in the days, that will be that contingency of that will be used up in this cycle. Is that right, Annabelle? I've got that right?
So the asset management plan, if I remember rightly, is due to conclude by September time. Yeah. So it will then be just the time at which we think it's appropriate to invite audit to come and work with us.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff. Okay, so I mean that's points for me. I'll let Councillor Schmier, who's been waiting very patiently, in at that point. Councillor Schmier.
Yes, thank you very much. I've got a couple of points. I'll start with the simplest one to answer. which is I noticed that the total number of days has gone up from 450 to 505. Now, maybe I've missed a bit, but was there a specific reason for that? Either because the council is taking services in-house and in effect is growing? And the second point that I just wanted to sort of reiterate, I think a point that you, Chair, Council Post has already made, is about the sort of areas in which internal audit is covering. I mentioned in the previous item my concerns about the waste services contract, for example, highlighting some failures, but also I'm concerned about our procurement policies in particular. If you have a look at cabinet agendas, you will regularly see very large contracts being signed and services basically or being provided by external parties, which is absolutely fine, but it's of course a question for us as an audit committee, and in particular for you guys as the internal auditors, to basically fulfill your definition as you put here, which is to add value and improve an organisation's operations. So those are the areas that I would like to sort of have specific sort of dives into, but I don't seem to see them within the draft audit plan on page 60 to 61. So maybe, Gavin, you can come back and give a little bit more specifics there, please.
Okay. We would normally do a separate piece of work on procurement strategy, which is also being updated as we talk as well. So that's again another example of an area that's being revised currently. I think the audit section have done more compliance work, but I would see that as a strategic project to look at. So again, I'd like to see that bed down, and it's certainly something that's on my list in terms of future audit work going forward. But it's placing those, you know, we've got a finite amount of days, so it's a balance of risk. So I will bear that in mind. In terms of the total number of days, the reason it's increased is we lost a lot of days last year in the first quarter due to the COVID-19 and getting people set up and working effectively. So that's why there's a slight increase in days. The amount of days available is still subject to review depending on the future delivery of the function, which is also being subject to review.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. Yeah, is that Annabelle indicating? Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to explain the process we're doing with the procurement strategy. Fundamentally, we've had an internal cross-cutting review, bringing together our SMT, which is, I don't know, over 40 senior officers in the council. We're also working with members on that, and it will be going to scrutiny for pre-consideration prior to it going on to Cabinet for approval in April. And what we've got there is an actual proposed implementation plan on the back of that. We knew we couldn't do all of the outreach work we wanted to do with the city and businesses across Norwich in time for the refresh of this version of the strategy. But fundamentally, we've put that as part of the implementation plan. So it's something to really have a look at and engage with if you have time. And as I say, it's going to go into scrutiny to the next meeting for consideration prior to it going to Cabinet. So there's again a lot of work going on in relation to that strategy.
Thank you, Annabelle. Martin is still there, not indicating. Any members indicating? No? Okay, so what I would say, two final points from me. The first question would be to Gavin, and to ask that anything that he presented to CLT that he wished to have in the audit plan was refused, and if he felt that that was justifiably refused. And I think it's a cheeky one, because that is me, and I guess it's a Mark over at External Audit there has seen what the draft audit plan is looking at. Would Mark have any advice for the committee of areas that it should potentially consider looking at in order to facilitate his work? So Gavin, was there anything refused, and was it justified? And Mark, do you think there's anything we should add to it?
No, nothing refused. Draft's gone through as planned, And it reflects the priorities of each director.
Thank you for that clarity. Thank you for that clarity, Gavin. That's good. And Mark, putting you on the spot a little bit there.
So whilst we don't rely on internal audit because we're not allowed to drive their audit plan and rely on them to that extent, clearly by taking into account risk areas of focus at each directorate level, it is providing assurance for the overall control environment the council has. So it would seem pretty good coverage to me at this point.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to give you that awkward question. That's my job. So I think that if there aren't any other points from members, we are here to endorse the external audit plan. I think, I would conclude that, I would like to see more contract management work take place. I think that it's welcome to have that asset management review. It's good to see the procurement strategy is going to move forward. We would like to see the skills developed within the internal audit team across this year as well. And so I think if we as a group here, can we endorse the draft internal audit plan? Are we all agreed? Yeah, that is agreed. And any against? No. So that is endorsed by the audit committee. And that brings us to the close of the meeting. So I'd like to thank everybody and all senior officers and external officer, external audit, and just a big thank you to Gavin for the work that he's done with us across this year. It's been a pleasure working with you and I appreciate your professionality. Okay, so that will bring the meeting